St. Paul, Paul the saint, Paul the perfectionist, the guy who was in control and a type A personality, sort of classic overachiever. Some of us can identify with where he found himself in his life. When you read his beautiful counsel to Timothy this morning, you hear the difference between living according to the precepts of the law versus the difference that Christ has made in his life. It's so different from how he talks about himself in the past and about his former ways as he does in the letter to the Philippians. In that letter, he looks at what he used to be, and he remembers that for a long time, he wasn't yet Paul, but he was Saul, and that something else had to happen first. And in sort of classic mode, the thing that happened to him was so impactful that he actually changed his name because of it. He didn't have time for slackers before, let us say, because as Saul believed himself to have been tested and certified, and he was impervious to criticism. He was a bulletproof student of the law and of logic. His sight was fixed on preserving the purity of the faith, and so he was a feared agent of religion. Like a bit of a foxhound, he sniffed out heresy and he pointed it up, and as everyone pounced on the offenders, he held their coats and whistled to himself. And before the blood coagulated, he was off to the next town. If he was sharp or intractable or a hard person to deal with, he simply believed that he was entitled to those things because he was doing the right thing. That was his belief at the time. So what an incredible shock for Saul to be knocked off of his horse on his way to Damascus one sunny afternoon. A sudden bright light in his eyes, and the voice of the one called Christ asking why Saul persecuted his church. I'm sure to him that was a very unlikely question, to have his world shattered while he writhed on the ground and heaven itself persecuted him because of these decisions that he thought he was making on behalf of heaven. To go from the top of his game to the bottom of everything in a snap, everything gone. Not just the credentials, but the authority gone, the standing that he enjoyed within society gone, and in fact, a part of Paul himself, a major part of him, that he believed in these accolades and in these accomplishments, even that gone. He would later label that as trash or garbage. One implication of all this is that the most usable people in God's kingdom are the ones who get knocked off of their horses. And for Saul, now called Paul, that past no longer possesses a power to dictate life. The horse has done something fundamentally different to him, and he now sees things in a different way because of the questions of Christ. And so instead, he's pulled into the future by a larger vision where he grows and shapes communities, and he shapes believers like Timothy. To quote briefly from another religious tradition, some Buddhists called this moment shakabuku, the rebuttal of old teachings and the repudiation of the former ways of being. Shakabuku is the swift kick to the head that permanently alters your reality. It makes us see that all our attachments and everything we thought was worth something could be worthless. Support group folks call it their moment of clarity, when a new path opens up, because if they stay with the old one, it will just be to death dealing. And so against all logic for them, they go ahead and choose the new path. At a certain moment, something that is beyond us yet also is us. And I want to call that something God. Something knocks us out of our certitude and our search for security. The diplomas fall off the wall, as it were, as the ground shakes beneath us. But the gift of that shakedown is that we emerge from the experience a little less burdened. If there's any forward movement to be had, any sharing in Christ, it is in traveling light together. That means evaluating what we're currently holding on to that could be hindering us in our ministry in any way. Looking at those things one by one and sometimes labeling those things as rubbish, like Paul did, before setting them aside. In order to get to the deep wisdom of Paul to Timothy, we have to ask ourselves today, what concessions are we willing to make for the gospel of Jesus Christ to be propagated? How much of the past can we disregard for the sake of the future? And I can't think of a better example for that than St. Francis. St. Francis's feast day on our calendar is set for Tuesday, 2 days from today. We will commemorate him tonight by blessing any pets you want to bring here at 6 p.m. And we do that because the stories about him that we have received tell of a man who had a special connection with nature and with animals. He did and said many remarkable things in his life, and we owe so much of our good spirituality to his influence. But just as St. Paul was once Saul, before St. Francis was Francis, he was Francesco De Bernadone, born in the year 1181. And he was the son of Pietro De Bernadone, who was a wealthy silk merchant. Francesco went to school for a few years, but you didn't really need school back then if you were going to inherit the family business and all the money that came with it. So instead, he mostly bummed around with a gang of his friends, and they got drunk and they got into trouble, and Francesco was their leader, as well as the person who paid the bill. In the year 1202, at about 21 years of age, Francesco went to fight in a war. His side lost, and he ended up in prison for more than a year before his father could negotiate his release. He came home, but his friends remarked about him that he didn't seem to be the same person anymore. He wasn't going to sports or to feasts. This guy who had had such a zest for life and a knack for getting himself in trouble just didn't seem to have the desire for any of his previous life. Now today, of course, we would say that he was living with trauma from the war, and he was trying to figure out who he was now and what his purpose was. Outside the walls of his town, he found an abandoned church, and he started going there against all odds, praying there, and after a while he was even sleeping there. He became an advocate for the destitute, particularly for the lepers. And his father had been planning to give him the family business up until then, but he now took Francis to court to disown him. And he argued in court, how could Francis be responsible for anything, given the shape that he was in? Did Francis fight him? Not for 1 second. In fact, he agreed with his father, and he disowned any claims to the family, and then in the court he took off all of his clothes, and he laid them at his father's feet, and standing in the court wearing nothing more than what God had given him, he declared that God would be his father from now on. Paul looked at himself in the mirror, and he said that it was the surpassing worth of knowing Christ as Lord that was the most important thing in his life. And he said everything else was garbage, and that he would now gain Christ. Francis walked away naked from a life of dissolute living. Paul crawled away, blinded from being an all-star and a know-it-all. Each of them came clean into a whole new way of seeing everything. It was really all about the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. Both of them had to leave a lot of baggage behind. And now this is a mirror to us today. The call of God is ever forward, unhindered by the weight of the past. That's the direction that I want to go in, and by God's grace I may, and that's the direction I invite you to join me in. We will get knocked off of our horse. That's just how it goes. It means we're finally getting somewhere. So let's stick together on that narrow, upward path toward Christ.